Hello again, everyone. I'd like to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. Stephanie Thomas is an earth scientist and activist in Houston. She received her Ph.D. from Southern Methodist University, where she researched ancient climate and environmental change 251 million years ago by analyzing ancient soil in northwest China. She received her Bachelor of Science degree from Tulane University and a Master of Science degree from the University of Nebraska. Stephanie currently examines how we can shift our behavior to mitigate and adapt to environmental change by incorporating insights from neuroscience, human evolution, trauma resiliency, psychology, and sustainable practices. And she will be doing Q&A after her talk, so please hold your questions till then. And let's please give a warm welcome to Stephanie.
Thank you, Hillary. I'm really honored to be here today with all of you. So thank you for coming and listening to this talk. So as Hillary mentioned, I got my PhD from Southern Methodist University, and I studied a time period called the Permian Triassic. And the Permian ended with one of the largest mass extinctions known in history, where about 96% of life of species went extinct. And the Triassic was, especially the early Triassic, was a time of biological recovery. There was a lot of, I don't know, it wasn't a great place to live for a while, I'll just say that. But after I finished my degree, I was actually recruited by an oil and gas company, and I worked there for 3.5 years until I got to a point where I could just not reconcile my history of researching climate change, my knowledge of what is going on with this planet, and what I was doing. So I didn't want my energy to be tied up in this really old way of doing things. I wanted to be looking forward and finding solutions to what we're facing right now. And what we're facing is pretty serious. So all of us are familiar with climate change. We've heard that there's debates going on, and really, the debates aren't as real as people would like them to be, especially people who are denying climate change. A recent study, I think, came out maybe a week or two ago that's showing out of about 2,500 peer-reviewed articles, there was one person who did not accept global warming. So the climate deniers at least are not publishing their work and is not getting it out in peer-reviewed literature. So for me, part of my process has been doing what Hillary said, moving from this place of cognitive dissonance to a place of consonance. And so I'll be talking to you a little bit about my process and how I view making that shift. And I'll also be talking to you a little bit about climate change and also mass extinction. So like I told you, I worked, my research was with the largest mass extinction in animal history, but what a lot of people don't know is that we're actually in the 6th mass extinction right now. So we are losing a great deal of species today, and predictions are that by the year 2250, 75% of species will have gone extinct. So this is a really, really big deal. And I think, as I'll show later on, that human impact is really the underlying factor there. Okay, so as I was preparing my slides, I was reading them to a friend, and I pulled up this slide, and he said, "What are you talking about?" So it isn't our fault. We have inherited the earth. And if we think of our lives as a scientific experiment, our birth is time 0, and there's a set of initial conditions. So we can't control the initial conditions. We are here, this is how it is, we're born into a culture that values consumption, and we're programmed to be consumers. That's how many of us have been programmed, and it's not just our families, it's our entire culture that's promoting these values. So in that fact, we aren't really at fault for this, at least not on an individual basis. And I'd also like to point out that we shouldn't be so narcissistic as to think we're the only organisms that can cause change, because we're breathing oxygen, and the reason that our atmosphere became oxygenated is actually through the photosynthetic process. So we can thank cyanobacteria about 3 billion years ago for giving us the atmosphere that we breathe today. And climate change itself, there was a period of time when vascular land plants started to colonize the continents of the Earth. And during that time, the plants actually drew down CO2 from the atmosphere and helped to create a situation of global cooling. So we are not the only creatures that have done this. And what I would argue is that we are the creatures that have intelligence enough to do something about what we're doing. So, let's say a bear walked into the room. What would we do? Yeah, we'd get out of Dodge. We'd get out of here. Unless, this is Texas and some people do have guns. So there might be some fighters among us. But really, when we're dealing with big issues, and even a lot of small issues, we go into flight and fight response, right? So if a bear walks in the room, we're gonna run. And I think this is part of understanding how we deal with issues such as climate change and mass extinction, is how we individually deal with responses to stress. So it isn't our fault, because we're kind of wired to behave in certain ways too. And when we encounter stress, we have, well, we all know about the fight and flight response, but then there's some other more complex responses, such as a freeze response, where we're the deer in headlights. We don't know what to do. We're just going to stay here, brace for impact. There's also appease, the appease response. And that might be a little bit more complex with a bear. But let's say the bear's here, and I say, well, I have some berries, I have some salmon, I'm going to give this to you, and I'm going to go over there. So I think of this kind of, Stockholm syndrome, where people who are captive live with their captors, and they have to find a way to get along to ensure their survival. So this is really reflective of ongoing stress, where you have to kind of bargain, and in a way, I feel like that's something that we are doing, is trying to bargain our way with climate change and with environmental devastation. The other thing is dissociation. So when something is so traumatic, we split ourselves off from it. So, and maybe not even so traumatic, but that is one way that we cope with trauma or stress, is that we step back and go on autopilot. It's like, if any of you have ever driven your car, maybe you're driving to the office at work, and you get to work and you don't remember driving there. That's kind of what dissociation's like. It's going on autopilot, just like, I just have to do this, and everything's normal, and even though I'm not paying attention, I'm somewhere else, I'm able to function in a normal capacity. I'd also argue that there's a different kind of dissociation that's much more structured around our belief system. So when you have an internal belief system and you're getting information from the outside that's conflicting with it, then you're going to have, perhaps as Hillary mentioned, cognitive dissonance. You're going to have a conflict there, and that in itself is very stressful and can continue the stress response. But it can't really move through it until that conflict is resolved. So part of what I want to talk about is as we move to consonance, you're associating and you're finding integration, and that's really something that everyone needs to be able to do on an individual basis in my belief, to move forward with making progress on climate change and on environmental devastation, mass extinction, etc. But the purpose of this slide is to inform you that, this is how our brain is wired, this is how our bodies are wired, and those kinds of responses are actually very natural things. So if you feel those kinds of, if you feel cognitive dissonance or you feel overwhelmed, it's a really natural thing, and you can be gentle with yourself. So as we respond to stress, one of the first things that I'd like you to become aware of is your physiological response. So your breathing rate might increase. You'll have increased blood flow, and you might feel a little warm or red, get sweaty palms. Your heart rate might increase. I'm feeling some of these right now as a public speaker. Your blood sugar levels are going to increase because your body is gearing up to run. Your blood pressure is going to increase, dilation of pupils, and your intestinal muscles are going to relax. Your body's not going to focus on digestion. It's going to divert its energy to other places. So part of this process is really getting in touch with your own stress response. So I want you all to take a moment right now and just close your eyes and check in with your body and notice if any of these things are coming up for you or not. Okay, so when we're really geared towards survival, I like to call this my thumbs down brain, right? The thumb area, this is what people consider the reptilian brain, and the reptilian brain is really focused on survival. It's where dominance and aggression come from. Sex, money, survival, those things are really oriented toward the reptilian brain. It's really about the survival of our species, the survival of ourselves as an individual, really. So that when we walk out into the street and a car comes, we're going to get out of the way. We're going to respond as quickly as possible, and that part of the brain is in control of that. And then in the middle of our thumbs down brain, we're going to have the limbic system, which is also called the mammalian brain, and this is more focused on emotions and feelings and connection, approaching other people socially. So that's where we find that part of our interactions. And then kind of up here, it's hard to point while I'm holding a microphone, we have our Neomammalian Complex, or the neocortex. And the neocortex is really concerned with planning and with simulation, so we can make predictions. So we can look at the past and say, oh, these things happened, and I'm seeing these things right now, so I can change my path so that I can avoid these things that I saw in the past. And really, what I think is crucial here is for us to be able to not discard the reptilian brain. Obviously, it has a purpose. We do want to survive. And on an individual basis, it's really important to be able to get out of the way when a car is coming and not have to think about it. But our lives are very stressful for the most part. I think a lot of people are really caught up in trying to make ends meet, going to work, working 9, 10, 11-hour days, sometimes more, driving in Houston traffic. That's all very stressful in the body, and we get a little bit acclimated to it. So we're not always aware of that stress. And so we may be acting from our reptilian brain when really there's other parts of our brain that would be more useful in those situations. Unfortunately, this slide got cut off. But what that says, the top line is creating opportunity for choice. Embodied intentional action. So by embodied, I'm talking about that process of checking in, noticing, am I stressed out? Is my heart beating really fast? being really present in your body, because our culture has typically valued the mind over the body, or at the expense of the body. And really, what is important is to have an integrated system so that we're aware of our body, we know what we're reacting to, and we can use reason to move forward. So introspection is part of this, checking in with your body and then asking, who am I willing to be? Who are you willing to be? I provided a model here, which is called the sober model. And there's a lot of other models out there. You might find one that works better for you, but this model, I like it because whenever we're confronted with a stressor or even a decision, we can apply this to really get back into our bodies and make an integrated decision versus one really based in reaction. So this is moving from reaction to action. And so the SOBER model stands for, the S is stop, observe, and by observe, this is an objective analysis of, okay, wow, my heart's beating fast, a car almost hit me, okay, this is what's going on. So just noticing what's going on. Breathe. And by breathing, we're bringing ourselves back into our bodies. Explore. So any given situation, there's multiple options that we have to resolve it. And through exploring, we can determine, okay, there's this option, there's this option, there's this option, and I like this one because of that, I like that one because of that, and then from an informed position, you can respond creatively. So, as we move on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about climate change and mass extinction so that you know what's going on with that, to provide some data about the issues. So this graph here, we see the top pink line, and that represents ancient and modern CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and this comes from the ice cores from Antarctica, except the modern data, that's present day data. And then the blue represents temperature difference. So what we see, that pink dashed line to the right goes up to about 390 parts per million. This is an old graph, really old, from 2012. And we've actually surpassed the 400 ppm mark. So what you can see is over the past 800,000 years, there's a cyclical up and down motion of the CO2 plot, which the temperature plot mimics. And then over the past 150 years or so, the CO2 levels increase exponentially. And that coincides with the Industrial Revolution. And I don't think it's coincidental. So we can see clearly that over the past 800,000 years, we have not seen CO2 concentrations anywhere near what we have in the modern atmosphere. In fact, CO2 levels were at about 280 parts per million or below. And as we go back in geologic time, it actually is about 3 million years before we see concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere as high as what we have now. So it's not natural variation that we're seeing. This is something different. And this figure here, it's a little, let me help you figure this out here. So this is a plot showing essentially extinction rates. And the x-axis here, this is 1 year ago, 10 years ago, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000, a million, 10 million, 10 million years ago. So this is a log plot, so it's not, it's a log plot there. And then the extinction rates are also logarithmic, excuse me. And what we see is that during the Cenozoic, this is back about 10 million years ago, a little bit more than 10 million years ago, it's relatively flat. There's basically a plateau. We see a little bump here that represents a time period of actually a methane release happened at that time period into the atmosphere. And then what we see is coming up that way. And it looks like a nice, maybe linear trend, but it's important to keep in mind that this is a log-log plot, which means that's actually an exponential trend. So, over the past, essentially 10,000 years, we're seeing more and more extinctions, and that coincides with basically the advent of agriculture and the mammoth extinctions, things like that. But more and more, we're losing species at a phenomenal rate. So I think it's important to remember that the conditions that we see today are governed by what is called complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems are basically systems that evolve. So one part of the system changes and it can influence the rest of the system. And they're governed by the initial conditions. So like I was talking about, we were born into this society. We were born on the planet at this time, and we live on the planet at this time, and these are our initial conditions that we have to work with. It's governed by the rules, and the rules could be the way that atmospheric gases operate in the atmosphere. The rules could be our economic structures that we have in place. So basically, it's just how the system operates, and some of those rules may be changeable, some of them may not, especially the natural rules. We really can't do anything about that. But other rules we certainly can. And then relationships, how things are interconnected. As Aristotle said, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this is characterized by emergent behaviors, which is essentially surprises. So when systems operate that, sometimes we can't predict everything that's going to happen. We can make some really good guesses, like, well, okay, the temperature is going to increase by about 6 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years or so. We can make those predictions, but then there might be something else in the system, like, wow, the ocean floors have heated up so much that the methane hydrates are going to be released into the atmosphere, and that's going to cause an extra 3 degrees of warming. So we can't predict everything, but we can make some reasonable guesses. And then the other thing is coevolution. So one part of the system changes, another part of the system changes. So there's a responsive element there. And I've noticed personally that as I've changed my behaviors to be more in line with how I want to live my life, I've noticed some of my friends doing the same too. So it gives us all each a lot of power. We can make a difference. A drop in the bucket is a drop in the bucket. Other people are going to see what you're doing to help the environment, to mitigate or even adapt to climate change. And they're going to be influenced by it. So here, let's take a quick look at the climate system. And this is from the perspective of climate in general, not necessarily what's going on today. I'll point out the highlights for today, for the present system. But unfortunately, I used a Mac. So I'm noticing things don't quite fit the way that I had planned them to. So just to let you know. Okay. Climate change is a function of many things on long time scales. It's a function of the tectonic configuration of the plates, right? Where the plates are influences how heat is distributed across the planet. And it also impacts the ocean circulation, how the ocean moves, the currents move. I think some of the baseline controls here is distance from the sun and the sun's intensity. So if we're further away from the sun, we'll be receiving less energy. If the sun is going through a period of less intense activity, we'll also be receiving less energy from the sun. Volcanism is part of it as well. So volcanism, while initially causes a bit of global cooling, the long-term effect of volcanism is global warming because it's releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Human behavior, as I think most of us in this room are aware, is also impacting this largely through releasing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And those gases include CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, N2O, and CFCs, so chlorofluorocarbons. And I know that there's been a lot of work in the 80s to reduce the amount of CFCs in the atmosphere because they were causing holes in the ozone layer as well. And then the other thing that I'd like to mention is biological productivity. So if we have really flourishing ecosystems, the plants can take up a lot of CO2. Unfortunately, human behavior through industrial practices such as farming, the destruction of the rainforest, we're reducing a lot of our carbon sinks. So we're, I guess, enabling more CO2 to remain in the atmosphere that might otherwise have been taken up by plants. And now let's talk a little bit about mass extinctions and some of the systematic controls on that. So first, direct killing of organisms. So many of you are familiar with the American buffalo and how that species almost went extinct because the white settlers, as they were coming across the US, thought it would be fun to shoot them. Over-harvesting, that's an issue particularly with seafood. Fishermen are depleting the supply of fish and oysters, and the communities are not able to bounce back from the harvesting. So we're losing species that way. Invasive species, we live in a really global society, and people move, not just people across the globe, but also plants and animals, and sometimes invasive species take root and they push out the native species. So that's another issue that's influencing mass extinction. Climate change, that is part of this as well. That changes habitats. It pushes species into cooler areas. You're going to find reduced areas where organisms are finding habitable. Places that were once habitable are not going to be habitable any longer. And that kind of goes to habitat loss, fragmentation, and destruction. I was talking about the destruction of the rainforest, but also fragmentation. The migration pathways are not what they used to be. And so animals are having to adapt to having loss of access to areas that they at one time had access to. And then environmental pollution. Poisoning. So many of you may have heard about the chemical spill that occurred in West Virginia recently. So 300,000 people were without water. And that spill, if people weren't able to drink the water, what happened to the wildlife? You know, we often get stuck thinking about humans, and I think rightly so. We need to be concerned with people and their welfare, but sometimes we forget about what else is there too. There's a lot of living creatures who were likely affected by the spill. And then lastly, disruption of biogeochemical cycles. So basically, we've put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, and that CO2 has somewhat been buffered by the ocean, so it's been reabsorbed into the ocean, but it's causing issues with coral reefs, for instance, because the waters are becoming more acidic. So it's disrupting their natural processes, and it's overwhelming their systems because it's happening at rates that are much faster than they can really cope with. And so that's something I want to be sure you all walk away with, is the rates of change here are orders of magnitude different than what I saw when I was researching the Permian-Triassic boundary. Things are happening even faster now. So I encourage everyone to act with urgency, but not with haste. And going to individual choices, do they matter? This picture comes from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So this is the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and people are pulling out fully articulated bottles of water bottles or soda bottles. And it's really changing the ecosystem there. Albatrosses are found to have plastic in their digestive tracts. A third of the baby chicks actually die because the albatrosses are feeding on the plastic. And while we do see these plastic bottles here, the majority of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is actually very small particles of plastic. So people or animals that feed on plankton are going to be taking in that plastic as well. It's very small bits. So my appeal to you, and Hillary's going to talk a little bit about this later, don't use plastic if you can help it. Let's get this out of the system. So I'm going to ask you again, who are you willing to be? So, like I said, we're not at fault for those initial conditions, but I would argue that we are responsible for what is at hand now that we know and now that we can see. And when it comes down to it, we really are our habits. So take a look at your habits and choose them wisely. Use methodologies to help bring you into the present moment, like the sober method, because that creates a suspension where you can make a choice. You don't have to rely on that reptilian brain to guide you along. And I do want to add, it's really important to listen to the cries of the earth, and that may sound pretty hippy-dippy, but it's really important to recognize that this is a really tragic thing that we're facing, potentially tragic for a lot of organisms, including ourselves. We don't know what our fate is going to be. And it's really natural to feel sad and angry and upset, and that's an important part of the process, is to feel those things. And then, going back to willingness. Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Going back to the idea of willingness, are you willing to look, to feel, to pause, and to act with compassion? So it's important to use what we see objectively and guide us using our reason to a compassionate response. And I will leave you with this cartoon, which came out years and years and years ago, but it really stuck with me. So what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Thank you all.